The wind cut sharp across the Colorado plains, stirring dust and whispers through the cracked wooden rails of the old auction yard. The place reeked of sweat, hay, and the scent of resignation. Horses, some noble and proud, others trembling from neglect, shifted nervously behind their pens. Amidst the chorus of snorts and the occasional clink of metal, a crowd gathered, most with weathered boots and deeper calluses, each with a history steeped in land and labor. And then there was him. Clayton Voss stepped down from his black Range Rover with the grace of a man who had never worked a day of manual labor in his life. Glossy leather shoes touched dusty ground, a contrast so stark it drew stares. His watch, a heavy gold piece barely hidden beneath a crisp sleeve, gleamed under the morning sun like an arrogant laugh. He looked out of place here, too polished, too loud in his silence. But it wasn't the clothes or the car that made people stare. It was the smirk, that amused little tilt of the lips that said he saw this world as a play, and himself as the only one worth watching. To him, this was sport. He'd made billions in tech before 40, bulldozed competitors, bought up real estate like it was monopoly. And now, on some strange whim, he had decided to get into horses. Not for breeding, not for racing. No, Clayton had recently become obsessed with the idea of owning something wild and breaking it himself. He was told this auction was authentic. He liked the sound of that. Authentic. Like sipping whiskey in old leather chairs. Like dressing up in vintage denim and pretending to understand grit. At the far end of the lot, behind a double paddock reinforced with chains, stood something he hadn't expected. A Mustang stallion, obsidian black from mane to hoof, muscles carved like stone beneath his dirt-matted coat, his ears pinned at every noise, and his eyes glowed with a savage awareness that felt too human. Not the broken look of a resigned horse, but something old, proud, and angry. Clayton's smirk deepened. "That one," he said to the auction manager, tapping the pen's edge with his finger. "He's mine." The man, sunburned, chewing on a twig, didn't answer at first. He studied the stallion, then Clayton. "Son," he said finally, "that horse ain't touched a rider in his life. Won't let no one near him without drawing blood." "Perfect," Clayton said, and walked off without another word. Inside the auction barn, the bidding began. Ranchers huddled in small groups, murmuring about hay prices and vet bills. Horses passed through the platform one by one, their fates sealed by nods, grunts, and numbers scribbled on paper. Clayton sat in the back, detached, waiting for his moment. When the Mustang was finally let in, if it could be called that, it took 3 men, 2 ropes, and a metal gate. The stallion reared, screaming a sound that turned heads and froze laughter. He didn't enter the room. He dominated it. Even from 50 feet away, the air seemed to tighten around him. The auctioneer, trying to keep the flow, forced cheer into his voice. "Lot 29. Wild Mustang. 6 years. Untamed, untouched. Government catch. Been here 6 weeks. Nobody's dared claim him. Do I hear?" 10,000, Clayton called out, voice calm and cool as bourbon. The room fell dead silent. The ranchers exchanged glances, some half laughing, others muttering. One old-timer leaned toward his buddy. He just bought a demon for the price of a truck. "No one else?" the auctioneer asked, eyes wide. Clayton stood, buttoning his blazer. "Didn't think so." The hammer fell with a dull thud. He walked toward the paddock, the crowd following at a distance like spectators drawn to a train wreck. The handlers warned him not to approach, but he waved them off. This was his show now. The Mustang pawed the ground, tail whipping like a flag in battle. Clayton stepped up to the gate, eyes locked with the horse. And then, in a moment that would be replayed again and again in gossip and retelling, he raised a gloved hand and slapped the horse across the muzzle. Gasps rippled outward. The horse didn't flinch. He exploded. With the fury of a wildfire, the stallion launched into the gate, hooves clanging like war drums, teeth bared in primal rage. Clayton stumbled back, nearly tripping. The horse struck again. Metal screamed and wood splintered. It took 3 men to pull him away before he injured himself. Clayton, breath short, cheeks flushed, laughed like it was all a game. "He'll learn," he said. But not everyone was laughing. Watching from the shadows of the barn was an older man named Thomas Reed, 62, bones worn thin from decades of ranch work, boots scuffed smooth at the toe. He wasn't much for crowds anymore, and he hadn't come to buy. He came for the quiet reminders of his youth, for the smell of horses and the creak of saddle leather. He'd known stallions like that. Not many still lived in the wild. Most were broken early, or destroyed if they resisted too long. But this one had fire, and he saw something else, too. In the split second before the slap, just as Clayton's hand moved, the Mustang didn't rear. He didn't shrink. He met it. His head didn't recoil. His body didn't twist. He stood and took it, like a challenge issued and returned. Thomas had seen that look before. In soldiers. In animals too proud to die with their heads down. After the commotion cleared and Clayton signed the transfer papers, the stallion was loaded, tranquilized, strapped, and bound like a prisoner into a steel trailer. Clayton posed for a photo next to it, one hand on the door, another holding a tumbler of whiskey like some twisted victory. He named the horse Vandal. By sunset, the trailer rolled toward Clayton's private estate. Thousands of acres nestled in the hills, a place of manicured pastures and fences too perfect to be real. He had already instructed his staff to prepare a special enclosure, far from the other horses, fitted with cameras and reinforced barriers. The plan was simple. He would break Vandal, not with kindness, not with trust, but with domination. He'd read somewhere that horses needed a leader, that if you showed them strength, they'd follow. That wildness was just weakness wrapped in rage. He believed that. He had to. Back at the auction barn, Thomas lingered. The night had thinned the crowd, and silence returned to the pens. He leaned against the post where Vandal had stood. Something gnawed at his gut, a quiet wrongness, a coil of dread, because horses weren't machines. You couldn't debug them, or reprogram them, or threaten them into loyalty. They remembered. They learned. And the ones like Vandal, if you tried to break them with violence, they broke back, not just in muscle, but in spirit. And Clayton, for all his riches, for all his bravado, had no idea what he'd just invited into his world. Thomas knew one thing, though. This story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Let me know when you're ready for Section 2. You said. The days that followed were nothing like Edward had planned. His usual routine of luxury, control, and certainty evaporated the moment he tried to mount the wild horse. The stallion, still unnamed, bucked violently, flinging Edward backward before he could even settle into the saddle. He landed hard on the compacted dirt, breath knocked from his lungs, dignity crushed beneath the weight of reality. The stable hands rushed to his side, but he waved them off with a scowl and a bitter laugh. "I'm fine," he growled, brushing the dust from his tailored shirt. He wasn't. Again and again, Edward tried to assert dominance over the horse, but it was like wrestling a lightning storm. The stallion refused the bit, refused the saddle, refused everything Edward thought he understood about taming. No amount of money could buy submission here. No coercion could bend this creature's will. That bruised ego started to peel back something Edward hadn't touched in years: humility. Each failed attempt wasn't just physical defeat. It was emotional unraveling. He couldn't understand why this mattered so much. He had dealt with CEOs, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, manipulated markets like they were mere playthings. But this one horse, this raw, magnificent beast, wouldn't give him an inch. On the fourth day, Edward stood alone by the paddock, watching the stallion from a distance. The sun had begun to sink behind the hills, painting the horizon in streaks of tangerine and violet. The horse stood still at the far end of the enclosure, ears alert, muscles taut, eyes unblinking. "Beautiful, isn't he?" a voice said. Edward turned to see a man leaning against the fence, dressed in worn jeans and a dusty flannel. He had the look of someone who belonged to the land, sun-leathered skin, deep-set eyes, a calm rootedness. "Name's Jonah," the man offered, tipping his hat slightly. Used to work with horses like him, before most folks figured they weren't worth the trouble. Edward didn't answer, unsure why he felt so exposed under this man's gaze. Jonah nodded toward the stallion. "You're going about it all wrong." Edward bristled. "And you know better? I know horses don't bend for arrogance. That stallion doesn't care about your money. your power, or your pride. He's waiting to see who you really are. The word struck something deep and uncomfortable. Edward crossed his arms. And who are you? Some wise old cowboy with a lesson to teach? Nope, Jonah replied. Just someone who made a lot of mistakes. Took me years to learn that trust isn't taken, it's earned. Something in the man's tone disarmed Edward. Not patronizing, not preachy, just honest. Jonah motioned to the fence. Mind if I show you something? Edward hesitated, then nodded. Jonah stepped into the corral, slow and deliberate, keeping his hands visible, his posture relaxed. He didn't walk directly toward the horse, but instead curved his path gently, respecting the stallion's space. The horse tensed, but didn't flee. See how I'm not chasing him? Jonah said quietly, I'm inviting him. He paused several feet away, and simply stood there, doing nothing. Minutes passed. Edward felt his impatience rise. Then, the stallion flicked his ears, took a step forward. Animals don't follow force, Jonah murmured. They follow peace. The horse stepped again, inching toward Jonah, nose twitching. Finally, it stood before him, nostrils flaring. Jonah didn't reach out. He just waited. Then the stallion lowered his head. Jonah turned, gave a little space, and the horse followed. No rope, no whip, just trust. Edward stared, feeling as though someone had opened a door inside him he didn't know was there. That's impressive, he admitted, voice low. It's not about impressing, Jonah replied, exiting the corral. It's about listening. They stood in silence for a long moment. I want to try, Edward said finally. And so began a different kind of training, one that had nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with connection. It started with simple presence. Edward would show up before dawn, coffee in hand, just to sit near the paddock and watch. No attempts to dominate, no commands, just watching, breathing, learning. Days turned into a week. He began to notice the subtleties, the way the stallion shifted its weight when nervous, how its ears communicated attention or distrust. He learned patience, not just with the horse, but with himself. On the 8th morning, the stallion approached him. Not quickly, not fully trusting, but it was a step. Edward didn't move. He let the horse smell his hand, feel his presence without fear. When the stallion turned away, Edward didn't chase him. He simply smiled. He hadn't smiled like that in years. In the evenings, Jonah and Edward would sit by the barn, sharing quiet conversations. Edward began to talk, not about mergers or investments, but about his father's cold expectations, the empty glass of bourbon that haunted his childhood, the way success had filled his bank account but starved his soul. Jonah listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes offering nothing but presence. It was enough. The horse, slowly, began to change too. Its eyes softened, its movements relaxed. Edward started groundwork, simple exercises, done without ropes, built on trust and consistency. One afternoon, with the sun high and a warm wind rustling the fields, Edward walked into the corral, holding a halter. He didn't raise it immediately. He waited. The stallion watched him, then stepped forward, unprompted. Edward raised the halter, paused, let the horse sniff it. Then, gently, he slipped it on. There were no fireworks, no applause, just a quiet, powerful moment of acceptance. Jonah watched from the fence, smiling. You've got a name for him yet? He called. Edward looked at the horse, now standing calmly beside him. Valor, he said. Jonah nodded. Fitting. But the peace didn't last long. A black SUV pulled up that same evening, tires crunching the gravel. Out stepped a man in a sleek gray suit, sunglasses still on despite the fading light. Edward stiffened. He knew that walk, that smugness. It was Carter Blackwell, a rival investor from the city, known for hostile takeovers and sharper-than-steel contracts. Edward, Carter called out, flashing a shark's grin. Heard you've been hiding out on a ranch playing cowboy. Edward forced a tight smile. Carter, what brings you here? Just passing through, but I figured I'd stop by and see what you've done with the place. Cute horse. Planning to race him? Or just another vanity project? Edward clenched his jaw. He's not for sale. Carter's grin widened. Everything has a price. Not this. Carter chuckled. We'll see. As the SUV pulled away, Edward looked back at Valor, who stood watching him with calm, steady eyes. For the first time, Edward didn't feel like a businessman defending an asset. He felt like a guardian protecting a bond. That night, he couldn't sleep. Carter's words echoed in his mind like distant thunder. There would be a challenge coming. He could feel it. But he wasn't the same man who had first walked into that corral. And Valor wasn't the same horse. They were both transforming, shaped not by force, but by faith. Morning came like a breath held too long. Golden light bled over the canyon's rim, and the dust of yesterday's turmoil still lingered in the air. Weston's body ached from the ground he'd slept on, but he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he had slept without the weight of ambition pressing down on him. He sat up slowly, eyes searching the corral, heart thudding louder than he'd expected. There he was, untamed, unapologetic, standing in the stillness of dawn like a statue carved from storms. The wild horse watched him, same as always, but something was different. There was no charge, no retreat, just presence. Silent, measured, mutual. Weston rose, brushed off the dust, and walked toward the corral. Not like a conqueror, not like a man with a plan. Just a man, stripped of pretense, humbled by what he didn't understand. The horse didn't move. He stopped at the fence, the same spot where arrogance had once gotten him thrown into the dirt. This time, he didn't reach for the halter. He didn't test the boundaries. He simply sat down, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked with the stallion's. He started talking. You know, he said softly, I always thought power came from control, from taming what didn't fit the mold, from making things submit. The horse flicked an ear, but I think I was wrong. A breeze tugged gently at the man's shirt. The sky warmed with the rising sun, casting shadows across the sand like ancient runes. I used to own everything a man could want, Weston said. Land, cars, women, a name. None of it meant anything in the end. I couldn't stop my father from dying, couldn't keep my wife from leaving, couldn't buy a moment of peace. The horse took a single step forward. I bought you because I thought breaking you would prove I still had something left, that I wasn't hollow. Another step. The stallion was close now, a length of rope away. I wanted to show the world I could still master something wild. Weston swallowed. His voice cracked. But it turns out you were the one showing me. Silence settled between them, as real and reverent as prayer. Then the stallion did something Weston would never forget. He lowered his head, not in submission, but acknowledgement, as if recognizing the change in the man who once tried to dominate him. Weston stood slowly, one deliberate motion at a time, hands visible, breathing even. He stepped into the corral. No ropes, no whips, no saddle. The horse didn't bolt. He didn't flinch. He waited. Weston took another step, then another. When he reached the stallion, he extended his hand, palm open. The horse sniffed it, snorted, then slowly, gently, nudged it with his nose. Weston's breath caught. Not dominance, not victory, trust. He moved with care, running his hand along the stallion's neck, fingers mapping out a language without words. Muscles twitched beneath his touch, but the horse didn't move away. Minutes passed like lifetimes. He walked beside him, one step at a time. The stallion mirrored him. It was a dance older than war, older than pride, one rooted in something deeper than either of them fully understood. For the next week, they built a rhythm. Weston would come every morning, say little, do less. No force, no tricks. Just presence, just patience. The stallion grew more curious, more accepting, and Weston more grounded. People came to see the horse who wouldn't be broken, and the man who stopped trying. Even Miguel returned, leaning on the fence with arms crossed and a knowing grin. I'll be damned, he murmured. The old man finally learned something. Weston chuckled. You ever think the horse wasn't the wild one? Miguel laughed. I figured it out the first day. Took you long enough. They stood in companionable silence, watching the pair move together. No halter, no lead. Just trust. But it wasn't over. Late one afternoon, a storm rolled in. The clouds came like wolves, hungry and gray. Wind howled across the canyon, stirring up dust and fear. The other horses grew restless. The stallion, too, pawed at the ground, snorted, ears pinned. Weston stood beside him, steady but alert. Then came the thunder. The stallion reared, eyes wild again, instincts surging to the surface. The past clawed its way back in. The echo of whips, of trailers, of cages. He bolted. Weston didn't shout, didn't chase. He just waited. Hours passed. The storm unleashed its fury, but Weston remained outside, soaked to the bone, eyes scanning the horizon. At dawn, the clouds broke, and so did something inside him. He sat in the mud, heart hollowed out, whispering into the wind. I won't cage you. Not now. Not ever. If you're gone, I get it. I just hope you know I meant it. Then, as if summoned by that sincerity, he heard hooves. The stallion emerged from the mist, head high, mane wild, and walked to Weston like it had never left. Not owned, not broken, but choosing. Weston rose slowly, awestruck. You came back. The horse lowered its head again. It wasn't just a moment, it was a reckoning. Weeks later, Weston no longer wore expensive boots or tailored coats. He had dirt on his hands, lines around his eyes, and a calm in his chest he'd never known. He didn't put the stallion in shows, didn't sell him, didn't boast about him. He just lived with him, rode him on occasion, bareback through the open plains, silent but full. One day, a boy from the town came up to the fence, wide-eyed, curious. Is he yours? He asked. Weston looked at the stallion, who stood near him, close but free. He smiled. No, he said. We just trust each other. The boy nodded like that was the best answer in the world. And it was. Because in the end, Weston hadn't broken the horse. The horse had broken him open.